All right. Thank you. All right, so we're going to begin our study of the book of Genesis. Genesis is the first of 5 books that are put together in one package deal. It's called the Torah, which means instruction or law or teaching is the meaning of Torah. I will tell you that we basically almost always call it the law. The problem with calling it the law is the fact that that has a little bit of a negative connotation to it. Anytime you use the term law, it means, to us, it means negative. It means, you mean I can't go over 55 miles an hour? How crazy is that? You mean I can't do this? You mean I can't? We see the law as holding us back from doing the things that we want to do. And so our understanding of the law is not the same as the understanding that they would have had. They saw the law as being a protection for what it is that they needed to do, but also as an instruction or a teaching. And so later on you'll see Paul particularly over and over and over again in the New Testament talk about the law is good and the law is perfect and the law is instruction and life unto us. He doesn't ever run it down and say, oh, thank goodness we're done with that. You know, it was something that was very important to them, but more in a positive light than we see it as. It always bothers me when I hear people say, well, you know, the Old Testament was the law and the New Testament is grace. And it's kind of said like that, law and grace. That's just absolutely not true whatsoever. It's the same story that runs all the way through. The law was grace for them. It was given to them in a manner of God's protection and provision for them, to bring them back into relationship with him, to bring them back into intimacy with him. It's through his grace that he gives that. And we see over and over and over again that when they fail that, he continues to draw them back in new ways. And then when we get into the New Testament and we see grace as a primary part of that, we also see that God has given instruction. Jesus gave very clear instruction that if you are filled with my righteousness, then it is your desire to go out and you have certain obligations. You take the message of the kingdom out there, and you take my word out there, and you treat others well, and you love your neighbor as yourself, and you do those things not to earn your salvation, but because you love me. And so it's basically the same story. We have to be careful that we don't peg the Old Testament as a negative thing and the New Testament as a positive thing. It's God's love story from Genesis to Revelation, the same thing.
Psalm 119, that's what the whole thing is about.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So we just want to be careful, because I fear that much of the Christian world fails to see that in that light. They tend to look at the law as a kind of a negative thing. So in the Hebrew, the title is Bereshit. It means in the beginning. What we will see is that Hebrew books generally take the first sentence of that book, and that becomes the title. You're going to see that over and over and over again. And so this one is because it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. So that's how the book of Genesis starts, in the beginning. That's where this title comes from, Bereshit. In the Greek, it was translated to genoso, which means origins or beginning. And because the Greek is similar to English, we take that title also. It's 50 chapters long. The author is Moses. I think it's very interesting, and if you go online, you can do your own study on this and see many of the great biblical scholars today are questioning that. Very surprising to me that Moses wrote this. There seems to be a great controversy going on right now. They just want to argue and fight with that. The problem is, over and over and over and over and over throughout the Bible, probably 30 or 40 different scriptures, we see Jesus himself, along with other prophets, stating that Moses wrote the law, that this was the work of Moses. And so it's obvious that Moses didn't write all of it, because he's going to die in part of it, and it's going to need to be picked up by likely Joshua or some scribes, or I don't know exactly who would have finished off that. But we know through scripture that Moses is pegged as the author. So why these people tend to fight this, I'm not really sure. But if you go online, it's surprising the number of people that tend to fight this. All right, so he is born 300 years after the end story of Genesis. The last story that we're going to read about in Genesis is the story of Joseph being in Egypt, and Jacob and his sons come to Egypt because there's a great famine, and so they're going to come there. That's going to be the story of how did these Hebrew people all end up in Egypt. And so that's where Genesis is going to end. Well, Moses isn't going to be born for another 300 plus years after that. So here's just an interesting thing to think about. It just fascinates me to imagine. Can you imagine being Moses and having God come to you and say, in the beginning was the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. And just give him those details and talk about, and I cried out to Adam and said, Adam, where are you? And he said, I hid from you because put yourself in that position of being Moses and hearing that come from God, and what that must have been like to have heard the stories of what he spoke to Noah, to have heard God say, and I relented that I had made man because they were continually wicked and evil. And Moses is writing this all down and hearing about all of this history, and because that's the only way. Moses obviously isn't in the garden, and he's not there when the earth begins, and so the only way he could get all of that is to hear it directly from God. I cannot even imagine how cool that is. Someday I'll ask Moses what he thought about when he did that. All right, the time that it was written, well, likely, we don't have any way to prove it, but it was very likely written during the time of the 40-year wandering. So after they go through the Red Sea and they're back on the other side and they wander for the 40 years, that's likely the time that these books were written. It spans more time than any other book of the Bible, 2,286 years from chapter 1 to chapter 50. Isn't that amazing? That's a lot of time. In fact, it covers more time than the 65 books that are going to follow. So if you start with Exodus and go all the way to Revelation, the amount of time incorporated there is less than what is incorporated in the book of Genesis. So it spans a huge amount of time. 2,000 years, around 2,000 years, are thought to be covered in chapters 1 through 11, with 286 years covered in 12 through 50. So you can see that the bulk of that was in the very beginning time, that the amount of time that went by. All right, let's talk about why was Genesis written. Okay, there's many reasons. I haven't gone over all of them, but here's some important ones. They needed to explain how things began. God needed his people to know that. To explain why God would need a chosen people to work through. So the people would need to know, we all need to know. Ancestry.com and 23andMe and all that is very popular now because we all want to know how we came to be. And this was something that God knew that people would need to know. Why God chose a people to work through. He could have worked through anybody. He could have worked through one person. He could have picked just one man and one woman and done what he needed to do, but he chose a people. Why? Why would he have chosen them? Events on a global basis show that mankind continued to fall into sin. So in the book of Genesis, we see not only Adam and Eve falling, but then the continual falling, all the way to Noah. From Adam to Noah is about 10 generations. And they just continue to get more and more and more wicked. And they get, and then after the flood is over, we have the Tower of Babel story. They continue to get more wicked. And it just grows on. So the story shows that it wasn't just one man who sinned and now we all pay the price. It's that we all continue to sin all the time. And it sort of sets into motion that. It also tells us the redemption plan that would need a people for God's plans and purposes. So God chose Israel. Now, was Israel a special people?
No, until he got chosen.
Okay, so they weren't unique, they weren't specially gifted, they weren't more beautiful, they weren't smarter, they weren't more talented. You know, they didn't have anything. Israel is a chosen people because God chose them. And they serve a God who is the one true God. That's what makes Israel special. Now, we see throughout history that God has definitely blessed the Jewish people in a way that we can clearly see. But it's his blessing upon them, not something that they were inherently born with. He could have chosen any people to have accomplished his plans and purposes with, but he chose the nation of Israel. And Genesis is going to tell us that story of how he did that. So how did he go about choosing Israel? Well, first of all, we just spent some time talking about how God made his covenant with Abraham. So he makes this covenant with Abraham, and then we're going to read here in a little bit how he then makes that same covenant with Abraham's son of promise. Now, Abraham has more than one son. He has Ishmael first, then he has Isaac, and then he marries Keturah, and he has 6 more. So Abraham has sons. But it's Isaac, the son of promise, that God told him before he was ever born that this would be the son. That's the one that the promise that he gives to Abraham will continue through. Then Isaac has 2 boys. They're twins. They live together in the womb. And from the womb, God chooses one of them. He chooses Jacob instead of Esau. Now, these are 2 babies in the womb, so it's not like they've sinned in the womb. But God had a plan and a purpose, and so from the womb, he chooses Jacob to continue that promise with. Esau also gets some blessing and some promise, and he does fairly well for himself. But he's not the son of promise. God's very specific. So it comes through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Over and over you see that term in the Bible. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, God's certainly the God of more people than that, but those were the ones of promise. And so it's important to know that the covenant came through that lineage. And that's explained in chapters 12 through 50. The nation of Israel would need to know certain things. They needed to know how they became a nation under this one true God. They needed to know where they would live as a people, how they would live, what type of things would they be expected to do, and what did God expect from them. These are all things that the nation of Israel, as they come together, are going to need to know. And this story begins in Genesis. The story of Isaac, who was a son born out of undue time, was on a supernatural basis. So I think you guys probably all know the story of Isaac. Mom and Dad were old. He was 100, she was 90. And God comes down and says, I'm going to give you a son. Well, even in those days, that's really old. And so they end up having Isaac, and he's born out of due season, but he is the son that God has promised. It's a supernatural birth. Also, just a point of interest, I guess that fertility continues with Abraham because, again, he has 6 more sons. And he's even older then when he has those 6 more. So he continues to have that blessing grow with him. But it was born out of an undue season, and that is the same way that God is going to birth his people, in a supernatural way that would seem to come out of a time that they least expected it. And we're going to see that when we get into our study of Exodus. God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the following things. Okay, these are the 3 that you need to remember. The promise of land. Great land from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. That's a large swath of land. Israel has never totally taken control of the land that God gave them in its totality. They came closest through when David and Solomon were in charge and were leading Israel. They took over a great deal of it, but they still didn't go from border to border. And now that border that God gave them that was like this, now Israel lives in land like this, and they continue to want to piece off segments of that land to where it's like this that they live in. But there is coming a time again when the borders that God gave for the nation of Israel are going to go back to the original borders that he gave them. So the great land was what he promised. The promise of a great nation. The descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky. That's a lot. And he gave them the promise of a great blessing that would come upon them. And that we can even see to this day. When you take into consideration the amount, I forget how many, I can't remember the details of it, but Nobel Prize winners and people who have accomplished great things in the medical field, and all the amount of them that are Jewish is huge. And so this blessing that God gives to these people who are just normal, average people, but who have received the blessing of God, is a phenomenal thing, and we see that even today. They also were a people that the world has attempted to destroy over and over and over again, totally wipe them from the face of the earth. That has been the goal of many a nation, and yet Israel still exists. The only nation in history to come back after an extended period of time with the same language, the same customs, the same culture, the same religion, all of those same things, and be able to regroup and rebound and rebirth into the same nation. No other country has ever done that. There have been nations that have come back, but they've morphed into different things. They've acclimated to the area that they're in. Israel came back as the same nation in its totality, the only country to ever do that. Mark Twain says, if you want to know more about God, look at the nation of Israel. That will tell you everything you need to know about God. Because it's so phenomenal. And they should by all rights be gone, because everybody tried to kill them, from the Crusades to the Muslims back in the day, to the pogroms, to the Nazis, to all of that. They should have been gone by all rights. And yet there are 8 million Jews that live in the nation of Israel, and another 8 or 9 million that live in the United States, with some dispersed in other countries. That's a lot of millions of people.
Did you say the Pilgrims?
No, the pogroms. The pogroms.
Oh.
Yeah, close. I don't know if the Pilgrims liked him or not. I'm not sure. All right, so back to Genesis. Genesis is, again, it was called the beginning, but it's the beginning of almost everything. These are just a few of the things that we see that start in the book of Genesis. The universe itself, the earth, life in all living creatures comes to fruition in Genesis. Mankind and womankind. Marriage, we see the first marriages in Genesis. The redemption plan is introduced to us in Genesis. We see sin come forth. Death begins. The family unit, the strength of the family unit begins there. Sacrifice, what Pam was mentioning earlier, this atonement in blood, sacrifice, what that all means. We see the beginning of the Sabbath. It's all of these are just things that are new ideas, new thoughts, new plans that we see come in the book of Genesis. We see the messianic predictions. Okay, we've talked about it. Christ, the seed of woman in Genesis 3:15. We also learned that the Messiah was going to be a descendant of Abraham. Jesus was. That the Messiah was going to be a descendant of Isaac, come through that son. He was. That the Messiah would be a descendant of Jacob, who is renamed Israel in chapter 25. And Jesus was. And that the Messiah would be from the tribe of Judah. In chapter 49, we see that. And of course, Jesus was. So these are all important messianic predictions that we see in Genesis. Genesis explains things. It explains the story of the journey to Egypt by Jacob, or Israel, and his 70 family members. It tells how they arrived and how the Israelites became a slave to Pharaoh. That's an important thing. They need to know why they were in Egypt. Why did they leave this land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why did they leave and go to Egypt? It tells that story. It tells how the family unit and the covenant of marriage, a man would leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they would become one flesh. That covenant marriage, how did that come into being? It tells how man became alienated from God and how to find the way to return to him. And it tells the distinct heritage of the people of God. Genesis explains the story of God's blessings, how God's blessing, which was lost in the fall of Adam, would return to the people through a covenant with Abraham. There's another example of God's grace that we were talking about. It was he was too desirous to have a relationship with his people to allow the fall to be the end. And so there was another way. It would take 400 years, but the promise of many descendants would come to fruition in Egypt, where that tribe of 70 people that came with Jacob would be multiplied into millions of people in the Exodus. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there are all kinds of different numbers given, but it was in the millions who went across the sea, who traveled across the sea. Isn't that amazing that they multiplied that much there? It's the history is in Genesis. It's critical to the history of Israel to understand the importance of Jacob and Jacob/Israel and his 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. That's a foundational teaching that is going to take us through the entire Old Testament. Each member of the nation of Israel knew which tribe that they came from and what that entitled them to. The land that they were given was based on their tribe. Expectations of how they were going to live as individuals, as a tribe, and as a nation would be issued in the covenants that God would give to them. So it was very important to them to understand how God divided the people into 12 tribes. And we read about that in the tail end of the book of Genesis. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. He has the 12 sons. They're each given a specific promise, a specific prophetic word over their tribe that is going to continue on throughout their history. It's going to determine what they do, how they serve God. It's going to determine where they live. There are a lot of important factors that are going to come out of what tribe that you come from. And so that history of where they came from needed to be. There was a lot of infighting between the tribes, a lot of jealousy, a lot of different things that happened. And so the history of where they came from was critically important. Now, there's some introductions that come in Genesis. One of them is the use of the term Elohim. That is a plural word in the Hebrew. The I am on the end means it's a plural noun. If you want to use just the singular, you would use the term El, E-L. So Elohim tells us that it's a plural of that word. Why is that important? Because there are some verses where it talks about the plurality of God in this way. Let us make man in our own image after our likeness. That's in the first part of Genesis. Our. Is he talking to the angels? No. So there's this, who is he speaking with? Well, then we get into the New Testament and it says, that Jesus was the Word and the Word was with God and the Word was God, and we have this, and he was there when all things were created, and we have this recognition from the New Testament. But if you're looking at it strictly just Old Testament now, before the New Testament came into being, you need to have this idea of what are these personality traits, these factions of God that are talked about, and we're going to see some of that. There's one in chapter 20, verse 13, when it says, when Elohim caused me to wonder. In the Hebrew, if you translate it literally, it says, and Elohim, they caused me to wonder. Very important to recognize there's a plurality there. Adonai Elohim said, man is become as one of us. That's when he told them you can't eat the tree of the knowledge of, that you can't eat the tree of life because you've become like us. You have the knowledge of good and evil now. So who is this us that he is speaking of? In 11:7, it says, let us go down. He's talking there. The other thing that's important, and we're going to see it oftentimes throughout the Old Testament, is this introduction of what is called the angel of the Lord, and it's usually always capitalized. The reason why the angel of the Lord is important and is different from just like an angel of the Lord, which could be Gabriel or could be, one of the messenger angels that would come, is because this one in the same verse normally identifies himself with God. So it says, and the angel of the Lord, but yet when it's talking and he said, I know that you now trust me, or now I know that you would have faith in me. So he's speaking as if he were God in the same sentence. Let's look at one example of that. Here, I'll finish this. This angel will call himself God, yet be separate. So it is understood to be the second person of the Trinity, or a manifestation of Jesus in the Old Testament. Here's one of the examples. Then the angel of the Lord spoke to her, and this is Hagar that he's talking to, and said, go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. So here is the angel of the Lord saying, I will increase your descendants. And she says, you are the God who sees me, she said, speaking to this angel of the Lord. There's a couple of others that I didn't copy for you, but I'm just going to read them to you so that you can see what I'm talking about. This is Genesis 31, when it says, the angel of God said to me in the dream, or the angel of the Lord said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked or speckled or spotted. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel. This is the angel of the Lord speaking. Where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. This is the angel of the Lord. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. So that's the example. That's an example of this angel of the Lord identifying himself as God. The last one was in 22 when it says, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So this is our introduction to this angel of the Lord, or the Trinity idea. Okay, now before we get into the reading, we're going to talk about these main stories of Genesis. The first one is the creation. The second one is Adam and Eve's sin and fall. And then sin continues in their children as Cain murders his brother Abel. Sin grows very quickly and permeates the entire world in the 10 generations from Adam to Noah. God chooses to destroy the world and save 8 people in the ark. The story of the Tower of Babel shows that sin very quickly returns to mankind. Doesn't take long at all before they're right back where they started. Then we see that God will choose a man from the Babylonian area, Abraham, to build a nation from. Keep in mind, won't you, that Abraham was not Hebrew or Jewish or anything else. I mean, he's the father of the Jewish nation, but he was selected out of Babylon, a land of idolatry. We know that his father followed idols, and so he was simply plucked out and selected. It's not that he was a man of righteousness amongst all this. God just simply chose him. He promises descendants, land, and blessing to the people who will come from Abraham through his promised son Isaac. To show that it is God's plan, Isaac will be born through supernatural circumstances. Both of his parents were too old to have children naturally, so God orchestrates the birth of their son by causing them to conceive when it would be physically impossible. Then he tests the faith of Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his son. By faith, Abraham proceeds to do all that God asks of him, And because of that great faith, God makes a covenant with Abraham that will last as long as there are descendants. It is unconditional, and it is pledged by God himself. Now, God continues the covenant promises through Isaac, the son of promise. Isaac and his wife Rebekah have the two boys, Jacob and Esau. We talked about this while they're in the womb. God will choose one of the boys, Jacob, to continue the promises through. And although he is far from perfect, God will use Jacob and his 12 sons to begin the nation of Israel. They will be the 12 tribes that the Old Testament centers around. One of Jacob's sons, Joseph, will be placed in Egypt through supernatural protection and favor by God. He will be placed in this position to save his 11 brothers and his father's extended family. This explains how and why the Israelites end up in Egypt. And then from there, the story will continue in the book of Exodus. All right, so what we're going to do now is just take turns, and I just kind of plucked out some parts of Genesis that'll go over this story so we can actually read them ourselves. We'll start here. Pam, do you mind reading the first one, Genesis 2?
Are we going to keep taping?
Yeah, you can keep taping. It's all right.
Genesis 2:20-25. But for Adam no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame.
Okay, so the beginning story that we have there, the only interesting point that I would bring out that we haven't already talked about is that she is called woman when she comes to Adam. It's interesting to note that she does not receive the name Eve until they leave the garden. So while she is in the garden, she is called woman. And then when she leaves, it talks about how Adam calls her Eve for the first time at that point. Just an interesting note. All right, let's read our next one.
Genesis 3:8-13. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate."
Okay, isn't that sort of how we all do it today? It was him. It was him. It was him. So this walking with the Lord is an interesting concept, isn't it? From Adam and Eve, it says that they walked with God in the garden, and of course they were naked at that time. And it says in our earlier verse they had no shame while they worked in it. Well, why would they? They were walking in what God had created for them, in the beauty of what God had created for them, and there was no reason or need to cover that. I heard someone one time explain it to me. I thought it was really interesting, and they said that this idea of physically walking is an interesting concept, as if God would, did he physically walk beside them? But the idea is that God is a spirit, and their spirits were united because Adam and Eve were in spiritual perfection at that time, and they were able to have that kind of a relationship. So basically, the way to think about it is Adam and Eve were spiritual, were glorified in a spiritual way, and they had bodies that actually moved them. So the important part of them was the spiritualness that walked with God, that spirit form. That's how you walk with God, in spirit form. And someday that's how we will also, when we're glorified, and whatever it is on the outside is far less important than what it is on the inside, because we are spirits who simply have a body in order to be mobile, right? That's really what we are. And so that's kind of the concept of Adam and Eve. I thought that was kind of cool. And he calls out, "Where are you?" Do you think God didn't know where they were? Why does he ask that question? Isn't that interesting? Why does he give them an opportunity to answer him? I don't know. I mean, I don't really know the answer to that. I just think that he could have just gone immediately to where they are and said, "I see you," but he doesn't. He says, "Where are you? Why are you hiding? Why? How did you know you were naked?" Giving them an opportunity to do some explaining.
Soul searching.
Huh?
Some soul searching.
Yes, absolutely. Who told you you were naked? All right, the next one.
Genesis 3, Adam named his wife Eve because she became the mother of all the living. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Lord God said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guide the way to the tree of life.
Okay, so had they been told not to eat the tree of life?
Yes.
Oh.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
That's right. They were told not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were never given any direction that they could not eat from the tree of life. So once they take the knowledge of the tree of good, they take the fruit from the tree of good and evil, then God says, well, now, we can't allow them. He's become like one of us. He knows good from evil. He cannot live forever. So before he takes that fruit, God made this decision to take them out of the garden. Before you have something?
I've never recognized this before, and I'm just kind of wondering where it says the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we always think that God is of all things good, but it says there as one of us knowing of good and evil. So. But we recognize that God knows good from evil. I mean, at this point, the fallen angels had already occurred. In history of the angels that fell from heaven had already occurred. I mean, his knowledge of good and evil. Does God commit evil? No. Does God commit sin? No, absolutely not. But the knowledge of that comes from a divine source. So I think that's why there. Anybody else have something to add to that? That's probably why that is in there. And so when he drives them out of the Garden of Eden, he makes sure that they can't get back in, right? The cherubim, the flaming sword, flashing back and forth. Doesn't that paint quite the picture? Yeah, you're not going to get back in there. All right, next one.
Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth."
Okay, so here's the story of the first murder that attacks. The part of this that we often hear that phrase, "Am I my brother's keeper?" We've all heard that, and it's used regularly. The one that really speaks to me in this is when it says, and God says, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Now, if the life is in the blood, and the blood is in the ground, and God can hear the cry of the life in that blood, that's a beginning little inkling of what I was talking about, that there is a teaching there that we just don't have a great understanding of. God says, your brother's blood cries out to me. I hear it. think that's pretty powerful. And so he tells him, "You will be a restless wanderer." We recognize that capital punishment has not yet been put into effect. That won't happen until after Noah. So Cain is not killed for murder. Capital punishment then will become even more prevalent when the Mosaic covenant comes in, because people are killed for adultery and other things also. But here with Cain and Abel, there is not capital punishment. So he's not killed at that point. The next one I'm going to read just because it's a short one. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I only have that in there because that is so amazing. 500 years old, he has his sons. Noah's going to live to be 950. So that's pretty amazing to stop and think about, isn't it? Adam lived long enough to see all of his descendants except for Noah. I mean, these people, it was just phenomenal how long they lived. Did they know one another? Did they talk? It's just such an amazing thing to think of. 500 years old before he has his sons. All right, the next one, Sherry.
Okay, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along on the ground. For I regret I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Okay. So this absolutely is such a sad verse, isn't it? To see the pain in God. Now, did he know before he ever created man that this was going to happen? Of course. Of course. He knew all along. The plan of redemption, remember, was from the foundations of the earth. It talks about in Revelation where it says the Lamb who was slain from the foundations of the earth. We've talked about that before. God knew what man was going to do, but to actually witness it and to see the consequences that sin caused in the lives of these creatures that he had created and made is, I think we can relate to that as parents. It's horrible to see our children make a bad choice. We all hate that. But what's even worse is watching them face the consequences for that bad choice that they've made. That's really hard to watch them suffer through that. And so I believe that, that helps us understand God's heart in all of that. But we also see the grace of God, because he says, you know what? There's one that I can save humankind through and renegotiate a new contract with, a new covenant with, and have a relationship with these people. And so the grace of God shows through. By all rights, he should have wiped everybody out, started all over fresh with a new group of peoples that maybe were completely different than human beings, whatever it was. But through his grace, he decides to make an exception in that. All right, Genesis 7.
Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all the living creatures as I have done.
Okay, so there we see the sacrifice that was made. This is to help you remember, too, that although we know the story, the VBS stories of 2 by 2, they come on the ark, and we know that for a fact. Remember that there were 7 of the clean animals. And
What would be a clean animal?
There's a section of animals that we're going to read about in Exodus more, but they're animals that, like the sheep and the goats and the different ones that God would allow to be used as sacrifice. Those were the clean animals. And so he gives Noah instruction to bring 7, the number 7 of those in, so that there would be some that could be for sacrifice later. Because if they were only 2 by 2 and he sacrificed them, then that wipes out the whole species of what goes on, which doesn't seem to make good sense. All right, the next one is the story of Abraham. We'll do a little reading on that one.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever cursed you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
So not just the Jewish people, but all peoples on earth will be blessed through them. Of course, there's another messianic prediction because we know that it's through Jesus that would be happening. All right, Genesis 15.
So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite.
No, you're right. Opposite
each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with a great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure."
Okay, so there's some prophecy that is given to Abraham. We, of course, once we get through the book of Exodus, we'll see that all of this was done in exactly that detail, as so much so that it says, "And afterwards they will come out with a great possession." Well, as the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, of course, by that time they've gone through the plagues and everything has happened. And as they're leaving, those of you who went through the study of Exodus may remember us talking about this. They just threw gold and silver at them and jewelry and said, go, just go, here, take it. So these people who had been slaves for all these hundreds of years and basically had nothing, walk out laden down with gold and silver, which they were able to use as they built the tabernacle and the golden calf, the earring calf, where they all throw their earrings in and made a calf. And so, but they had all of this with them. Who in their right mind would think that a whole group of millions of people leaving as slaves would walk out with all of these worldly possessions? Well, here, 400 years earlier, God said, and when they leave, they will leave with great possession. So that's pretty cool. All right, next one.
The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions." So Isaac stayed in Gerar.
All right, so there's that promise coming through Isaac that we've talked about a couple of times. All right, so then our last part of Genesis is the story of Jacob, and let's read that.
Genesis 35. After Jacob returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you." Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel.
There you go. It looks like a word's missing. So this is just the promise then coming through Jacob, and because Jacob is the two important things is that Jacob's name gets changed to Israel. That is where the term Israelites come from, because Israel was Jacob's name. Israel also became the nation, and Israelites is what the people were called because of this. And so there's many promises there. Not only will nations come from him, but kings will come from his descendants, from his son Judah is where the lineage of kings will come from. So this setting up of a stone pillar, what does that tell you now that you've had your study? Okay, so this is a covenant that God is making with him, and so this setting up of this stone pillar is just an example of that. So then we have, sorry Trudy, you get the names. It's the 12 sons.
Jacob had 12 sons. The son of Leah were Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. The sons of Rachel's servant Bilhah, Dan, and Naphtali. The sons of Leah's servant Zilpah, Gad, and Asher.
So these 12 names, it's important that people know them, recognize them, because these are the tribes. Back when Jesus is a baby and his parents bring him to the temple for his dedication time, there is a woman there, Anna, who is a prophetess, and we're told she is from the tribe of Asher at that time. Well, you need to recognize, oh, that's one of those 12 that we, read about back there, because there was a son named Asher belonging to Jacob. All right, and Genesis 37?
So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. The ornate robe he was wearing